Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, I am going to walk you through a really interesting paper from 2014 by Marsh and his colleagues. It was published in Pharmacoeconomics, and it's all about how we can use something called multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA for short, to make better healthcare decisions. Basically, this paper review how MCDA has actually been used in real healthcare setting. So let's jump in and see what they have found. Moving on to the second slide here, which is the introduction and research problem. All right, so you know how we usually evaluate healthcare interventions? We tend to focus on cost effectiveness, basically how much bang for your buck you can get in terms of equality adjusted life years. But here's the real thing. The real decisions are way more complicated than that. You have got to think about effectiveness, sure, but also safety, equity, how severe the disease is, and whether there are other treatment options, and the list goes on. But right now, a lot of these factors just get weighed informally in people's head, which isn't very transparent or consistent. That's where MCDA comes in. It's supposed to give us a structured way to balance all these factors, but back in 2014, people were using it in all different kind of ways, and there wasn't really any clear guidelines. So Marsh and his team wanted to take a step back and see what was actually happening out there. So moving on to the research objective. So what were they trying to do in general? So it is pretty much straightforward. They wanted to help other researchers and decision makers who are thinking about using MCDA by reviewing how it's been done before and what we can learn from it. Now, this isn't the kind of paper where they are testing hypotheses or running statistical models. It's more exploratory, if that makes sense. They were asking questions like, where has MCDA been used? What methods did people choose? What worked well and what did not? So let's take a look at those questions more closely. So the next slide here is the first question. Where exactly has MCDA been used? They looked at all kinds of decision contexts, things like should we cover this drug? Should we authorize it for the market? What should doctors prescribe? How should we allocate research fundings? And then what kind of interventions are we talking about? Drugs, medical devices, public health progress, screening tests, surgical procedures, you name it. So basically, they were trying to map out the whole landscape to see where MCDA is actually being applied in the real world. Moving on to the second question. So the second set of questions gets us into the nitty-gritty of how MCDA actually works. Like what kind of methods are people using? How do they pick their criterias? How do they score things? How do they decide what's more important? How do they weigh everything? And then how do they put it all together? They also wanted to know if if they wanted to know if certain methods work better for certain types of decision. Like maybe if you would use one approach for evaluating a drug and a different one for public healthcare program. And probably most importantly, what are people actually saying about using MCDA? What works? What does not work? What lessons have they learned? What's the stuff that really matters why when you're trying to decide if you should use this approach yourself or not. So how did they actually do this review? Let's look at this slide here. Well, since it's a review paper, their data is just other published studies. They searched two big medical databases, Medline and Embase, looking for papers about NCDA in healthcare. They ended up funding 40 paper covering 41 different NCDA applications going all the way back to 1990. But here's what's interesting. More than half of those papers came out after 2011. So you can see there has been big surge of interest in MCDA recently, and they have kept it focused. They only included actual applications of MCDA, not just the paper talking about it in theory. So for every study they found, they pull out the same key information which is being used in standard templates. So that's how they extracted, the data. First, what kind of decision was being made? Coverage, authorization, prescribing, or funding. Second, what type of intervention? Is it a drug, device, public health stuff, whatever? And then they really detail stuff. What MCDA methods did they use? What criteria did they look at? How did they score and weigh things? Who was involved in the process? By pulling out the same information from every study, they could actually compare them side by side. Now, they did run fancy statistical models or anything like that. They did not. Moving on to the analytics approach slide here, this is more of a descriptive analysis. They sorted all the studies by decision type, intervention type, and methods used, and then they looked for patterns. They also did this qualitative analysis where they pulled out common themes from what people were saying. What advantages kept coming, what challenges, how did their approaches differ? So at the end of the day, what they have created is basically a roadmap of how MCDA was being used in healthcare, but leading up to 2014. Not a method, just a clear picture of that landscape. Moving on to their key findings. All right, so how did they find and what did they find? On this method side, most people were using something called a value measurement approach. Basically, you score each intervention on different criterias, then you weigh those scores and add them up to get an overall value. But you know what? Here's the catch. There was a ton of variation in exactly how people did this. Different scoring system, different way of weighting, different way of combining everything. And here's the kicker. There wasn't really any rhyme or reason to which method people chose. It didn't seem to depend on what kind of decisions they were making or what kind of technology they were evaluating. It looked more like people were just using whatever method they were familiar with. So moving on to the reported advantage. So what are people saying about le- saying they like about MCDA? Like, why did people were saying they loved MCDA? Big four things stood out. First one is transparency. Instead of just having trade-off happens in people's head, MCDA made everything explicit. You can see exactly what's being weighed and how. Second one is it gives you a structured process for group decisions, which is huge when you have got multiple stakeholders who need to agree on something. Third, it actually helps get everyone engaged because it creates a common framework and language for the conversation. And fourth, it lets you think about value more broadly than just cost effectiveness. You can bring in things like equity and unmet need that might otherwise just get left out. Moving on to the challenges. Of course, there would be some challenges. It's not all sunshine and roses. So the first challenge that they faced was there was no standard playbook. People are doing MCDA in all the different ways, and there were no clear guidelines on what method to use and when. Second one was you've got the garbage in, garbage out problem. If you pick the wrong criteria or wrong thing, weight things poorly, your results aren't going to be meaningful. The third one is it's not clear how MCDA should fit in traditional health technology assessment tool we are using. That one actually stood out to me as well. Does it replace effectiveness analysis or complement it? Nobody was quite sure. And finally, there's this big one. There's a real concern that MCDA might just become an academic exercise if decision makers aren't actually using the results to make real life decisions, then what's the point? Moving on to the implications for practice. So, what does all this mean for practice? Well, the authors of the paper are pretty clear that MCDA shouldn't replace traditional methods like cost effectiveness analysis. It should work alongside them. We definitely need better guidance and standards so that people are doing MCDA in most consistent and transparent ways. At the time they wrote, MCDA in healthcare was still pretty experimental. They are calling more rigorous work that's actually designed to inform real decisions, not just theoretical exercise. But the bottom line is, when it's done right, MCDA really can make healthcare decisions more legitimate and transparent. Moving on to the conclusion. So, wrapping up here, what Marsh and his team has given us is a really comprehensive snapshot of MCDA landscape in healthcare as of 2014. They have mapped out what's being used, how it's being done, and what are the pros and cons. And they have identified both the real promise of this approach and pretty significant gaps that still need to be filled. For me, the biggest takeaway here is we need more centralized, rigorous approach going forward. But this paper gives us at least a foundation. So both look at foundation for both, to look at where we have been and a guide for where we need to go. I enjoyed reading this paper a lot. So thank you so much, guys, for your time. I would happy to take on any questions you have in the comments below. Thank you.